So, if you were making your perfect version of Pride and Prejudice, what would it be like? Who would you cast as Mr. Darcy? What house would play Pemberley? I always think that's a very important question. But also, what would you need to keep from the book, right? Like, what essentials of the book do you need to make sure make it into the movie? Is it the dialogue, the basic characters, the plot line, all of the above? Let me know in the comments down below. But today I thought I would share some of the things that I think that any good Pride and Prejudice adaptation absolutely needs to be a good adaptation. My name is Ellie Dashwood, and this is my channel where we talk about history and literature. If you like either of those things, please subscribe. So first of all, when it comes to approaching adapting a book into a movie, that is a big ordeal, right? Fans are going to have so many opinions. You can upset them quite easily. However, when I was thinking about it, for me, what makes a good Jane Austen adaptation, I think it comes down to three basic principles, right? These are things that need to be established even before you approach the book. Like, how are we going to approach the story in this adaptation? And these are 1, respect for Jane Austen, 2, respect for history, and 3, respect for the Jane Austen fandom. So I think in general, there is a lot of respect for Jane Austen out there, right? She is one of the most beloved authors of the 19th century. She's highly adapted and translated. But sometimes I just personally feel like that respect needs to go a little bit deeper. Okay, I know I'm kind of like a slightly crazed Jane Austen fan here, but in my personal opinion, I think she was one of the not just most brilliant writers of the 19th century, she was one of the most brilliant philosophers and students of human and societal nature. And I think when you have that deep respect for her on that level of she was brilliant when it came to thinking about things, right? She would have been one of the most celebrated philosophers of her time, I think, if she was a man. Most simply put, I know people are always going to fight me on this, but I do think that Jane Austen's works often get devalued because she's a woman. They get overlooked, and a lot of really complex aspects of them are dismissed as not even existing because of it. So for example, I have a whole video titled How Not to Marry Mr. Wickham that looks at how Jane Austen was analyzing the nature of reality and how we establish reality in our own perception. And that was a topic which of course was being debated by other philosophers of her time. But the fascinating thing about Austen is she would come to these conclusions, and instead of writing her theories out in a nonfiction book and publishing it and calling herself a philosopher, she more or less wrote them into novels. And I think this was actually a brilliant move on 2 different fronts. 1, distribution and popularity. Let's all be honest here. When was the last time you picked up a 18th or 19th century philosophy book for the fun of it? That was not assigned class reading, right? Not very many people have, but how many people have picked up a Jane Austen book or watched a Jane Austen movie? A lot of people. Jane Austen was able to have a much wider distribution for her ideas and reach a much broader audience across centuries because of how she distributed them. The other reason I feel like this was a huge power move is because humans understand things in stories. If you look at Christian tradition, one of the things that made Jesus such an amazing teacher is he often used illustrations and parables to teach complex topics in a very simple and memorable way. For example, a lot of people who aren't even Christian are familiar with the idea of a good Samaritan, of the prodigal son, right? These are complex ideas that are memorable because they were taught in story format and we can really grasp it on a human level. And I think that just goes back to how we are creatures of context. We understand ideas best when they are put in some sort of context. Likewise, if I had a friend who was dating a Wickham, I could be like, girl, I think you're dating a Wickham. Would I actually say that? No, I doubt that would be productive at all. But she would know what I was saying if I did say that. However, I do think Jane Austen understood how humans learn and how we process things, and she presented her ideas in that format. Now, you might be like, Ellie, that's great. But what does this have to do with movie adaptations of Pride and Prejudice? But before we get into that, here's a word from this video's sponsor. So you guys know I've been sleeping in Brooklinen's amazing sheets for a few years now, but what I've recently discovered are their blankets. Not only are the blankets outstanding quality, but I feel like they elevate my bed styling, which is something I've been getting more into. If you're looking for the perfect gift for someone who needs a cozy hug in their life, then these are my top Brooklinen picks. First, the Dreamweave Waffle Bed Blanket. For styling, I like to use this as an interesting accent texture, but it's also so cuddly, I kind of just want to kidnap it from my bed and then watch movies with it. Second, the Alpaca Throw Blanket. Each blanket is made by textile experts in Peru, and if that doesn't sound classy enough, it also has a very classic pattern with some pretty fringe that adds just an elevated touch to the bed. Third, but definitely not least, is Brooklinen's Luxe Sateen Hardcore Sheet Bundle. I love getting contrasting sheets and duvet cover because it adds more interest into my final style, and I love the fact that you're able to mix and match colors and sizes on Brooklinen's website. They also have fast, reliable shipping and stores in several major US cities if you ever need a last-minute gift. And I have to say, this is one of my favorite bed looks yet, with the textured accent and the little touch of classic beauty going on. If you're looking to get the perfect cozy gift for someone in your life, then definitely check out Brooklinen. You can get 15% off your first order using the link in the description below. Thank you so much for sponsoring this video, Brooklinen. Now, back to Jane Austen. Like, Ellie, that's great. But what does this have to do with movie adaptations of Pride and Prejudice? And I think it goes back to, if you have respect for Jane Austen on this deep level, you don't go and change different aspects of her story needlessly or think that changing them would improve them, right? Like, you would respect, for example, her characters. One of the things you guys love the most about Jane Austen characters is that they are timeless. And I think what makes her characters so timeless is her study of human nature, right? She was able to boil people down to the most fundamental aspects of humanity that don't change across culture or time. And that's why 200 years later, they still seem so real and relatable to us, right? That was part of her genius and her study of people. But if you have that respect for her and her characters and realize that's what makes them successful was her insight into human nature, you wouldn't needlessly go and rewrite the characters, right? And I think this was one of the really big problems that was with Persuasion from Netflix a few years ago. I don't mean to pick on this movie, but I do feel like they took Anne Elliott's character, which was a very nuanced and realistic character study that so many women relate to today. They took that and they were like, I don't think she's good enough. What if we go like with the really edgy, snarky Anne Elliot that's nothing like the book? And so I feel like there wasn't enough respect for Jane Austen's original insight when making that change. Potentially, again, this is just my opinion here. If movie makers approach Pride and Prejudice with a deep respect for Austen, obviously they're going to have to cut stuff and change stuff because turning a book into a movie requires that. But they're going to do it in such a way that they need to look at underlyingly, like, what was Jane Austen's theories on different things? What do the characters represent? And try to do it in line with the underlying facets that are honestly what make her books so popular, right? You don't want to take what works amazing in these books and then just like switch it out for something entirely different that's not going to work as well. I think this also really goes into the second aspect, which is respect for history. Jane Austen was the premier social historian of her own era. I have so many videos breaking down how her books are completely in line with known history of the time period or are more accurate than some historical sources. Like, I think I cover how Darcy and Lizzie could really be married by a special marriage license. The evidence is actually showing no, Jane Austen was in fact right. But I think one big aspect when you ever approach period dramas that are very female-centered is sometimes people feel like they need to add extra sort of feminist social commentary on top of them. And I definitely think, again, this was something we saw in Persuasion 2022. But I think Jane Austen's stories inherently by themselves are some of the most important documents of women's history of their time period. So women's history is often massively overlooked. It's massively undertaught, but Jane Austen focused on it, right? She focused on the daily lives of women of obviously a specific social class. Not all women had the lives of Elizabeth Bennet or her other characters, but she accurately portrayed them in nuanced emotional detail. And that is something you simply don't get in a lot of other places. And so I think by portraying that accurately on screen as Austen did, you're not only teaching women's history, but women are smart enough to look at that and be like, you know what? I'm glad I am not in the same position as Charlotte Lucas, right? That I have more options than what she had. I think women can draw these own conclusions without you having to add like this extra snarky commentary on it. But again, having that accurate representation of women's history was so incredibly powerful on its own, and respecting that and portraying it accurately, I think is an important part of adapting Austen. So the third thing any good adaptation needs is respect for the Jane Austen fandom. Recently, I put it out to you guys on the community tab here on my channel. What do you love about Pride and Prejudice? And you all had such amazing answers, and I think a lot of them were developing very similar themes of the timeless characters, of the messages, of sometimes just the general ambiance, right? Like there's something very safe and comforting about Austen's works that's been appreciated throughout time periods. Of course, soldiers famously read her works in the trenches of World War I because there was just something very comforting about it. And I think filmmakers really need to look to what works well. What do people love about this? And then build off of that instead of changing it. So I was thinking, imagine taking all of the best aspects of Austen, preserving her genius, but then adding to it an amazing soundtrack and sets and costumes and acting. And I think that there's ways you can play with the story that still shows respect for all three of these things. So for example, if you take 1995 Pride and Prejudice, so many people think it's so close to the book, and it is. It keeps so much of Austen's original story, but they added things, right? Like that first scene where Elizabeth is out walking and you see Darcy and Bingley riding horses to look at Netherfield. That scene is not in the book, but it goes along with the overall spirit, tone, and characters of the book. And so I think that's one of the reasons that fans accepted it. Or if you look at other things they added in 95, obviously there's no jumping into lakes in the book, but there's also no Darcy fencing, which I always think that Darcy fencing scene is hilarious. He's like, I will conquer this. But at the same time, like I haven't heard of a general fan revolt because they made Darcy fence, right? And so I do think that there's interesting things you can do with the story while still respecting it. Now, of course, another essential for a good adaptation is the writers watching this video and then liking it. Don't you think that would be so incredibly helpful? And you guys may also like this video if you're so inclined. Thank you. Then if we look over at the 2005 version of Pride and Prejudice, it obviously has its pros and cons. I've talked about it so much on my channel, but I think it did a lot of things right. And one of the things I think it did right is respect. Respect for Austen, history, and the fandom, in that it approached the story in a genuine way. What I mean by that is if you remember my video on Is Mr. Darcy Shy? Obviously, Darcy gets this major personality makeover in 2005, right? He's this shy, sweet little cinnamon roll that's just not understood. which is not exactly super accurate to like a very strict reading of Pride and Prejudice, but it is someone's genuine subjective reading, right? And we all read subjectively. When we're reading a book, we're seeing it in our head through our lens of life. And I genuinely think that is someone's reading of Mr. Darcy. When they read the story, that is who he is. And they're like, I'm going to share what I genuinely see in the story with everyone. And I do think that there's room for that in Austen movie adaptations, of sharing the movie maker's authentic experience of the story, the movie that is in their head. Now, because I just love picking on Netflix Persuasion, I feel like that's not what we were seeing there, right? This wasn't someone who's like, this is how I genuinely read Anne Elliot. I understand her on this deep level. It was more like, no, we're changing that. One of the other things that I think Pride and Prejudice 2005 did really well was act as a recruiting tool. So many people saw that in theaters, and it was the first Austen that they appreciated or they understood, or maybe they had ever come into contact with, and it recruited them into the fandom. They started reading Pride and Prejudice, and then they branched out to her other works, and then they went down the rabbit hole of Regency and Victorian history. It effectively did that, where I feel like, for example, I could imagine people watching Netflix Persuasion 2022 and then reading the book and being really disappointed. Like, if they love that movie, they'd be like, there's a real lack of her getting drunk or having a bunny in this. They'd be like, where is the drunk bunny moment? But I do think that this is a problem some book adaptations have. Like, for example, I loved the Phantom of the Opera movie when I was a teenager. You know, like with Emmy Rossum and Gerard Butler, and it's so emotionally unhealthy. Like, I was listening to the soundtrack the other day as like a full-grown adult, and I'm like, wow, the Phantom is creepy. But alas, I think I knew that as a teenager, but like I think now as a full adult, I'm just like, I don't think I fully grasped the sheer level of creepiness that is the Phantom before now. Anyway, that's not relevant. What is relevant is, as a teenager, I then went and bought the Phantom of the Opera book, like the original one that inspired Andrew Lloyd Webber to write the Phantom of the Opera, right? It is nothing like the movie or the musical. Just in case you were wondering. To the point that I'm like, I like this movie. I don't like the book. But I do think a good Jane Austen adaptation doesn't create that problem, right? Like, it's like, I love this movie. Ooh, I also love this book. And now I love her other books. And now I love history. And now I understand myself better. Okay, so this might actually be quite the long chain of events I'm expecting to happen for people. But my point is, a good movie can set it off, right? It can start this domino. Anyway, that is how I think someone can make it the perfect Pride and Prejudice, if they respect Austen, history, and the fandom. Of course, I also have thoughts on like costumes and sets and stuff, but alas, this video can't be forever long. Anyway, let me know in the comments down below what you think the perfect Austen adaptation needs, and also remember to check out this video's sponsor. Remember that right now you can get 15% off your first order with Brooklinen using the link in the description below, and get yourself some cozy little gifts. I'm just like obsessed with wearing it like this. This is my new fashion statement. It's called Toasty. Woo! Maybe I should go for the rumpled look. There's so many ways I could style this, guys. And as always, guys, keep being awesome, because you're awesome. Bye!